Good evening. I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to tonight's Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. Concern is growing about a possible sixth mass extinction, this one the first brought about by human negligence. Our guest, Andrew Knoll, who's the Fisher Professor of Natural History and Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University, is an international authority on how evolution responds to mass extinctions. Tonight, he explains how the geological record of past extinctions can help us understand the prospects for future life on Earth. Dr. Knoll is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society and the winner of numerous awards, including one of the most prestigious natural science awards, the International Prize for Biology, conferred in Tokyo in the presence of the Emperor and Empress of Japan. Dr. Knoll appeared on this program a few years ago to discuss his book on evolution, and he'll talk about his forthcoming book later in tonight's program. We're very honored to welcome Andrew Knoll. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we're delighted that you're going to give us this background because there is a bit of confusion around what we're enduring at this time and what the future holds for us. Could you start us with a little bit of the background about the previous extinctions, since you've done so much on those?
Okay, well, it's interesting that until about 1980, there wasn't a lot of work on geological mass extinctions or interest in them. And then two things happened. One was Walter Alvarez, a geologist from Berkeley, found evidence of a meteor impact right at the point in the record where the dinosaurs disappear. And that stoked a lot of interest in the phenomenon of mass extinction. And at the same time, on the same time scale at least, the late Jack Sepkoski went to the library and simply tabulated the first and last appearances of different taxa in the oceans through time. And what Jack found was that diversity initially goes up, then it collapses. Then it goes up and it collapses. And in fact, it has collapsed 5 times in the last 500 million years.
And brought about by different causes, is that correct? Different
That's
things.
right.
An asteroid here and something else there.
Initially, people thought that this was going to be easy. Every time an asteroid hits, there's a mass extinction. But in fact, there's only evidence that that happened once, and that was 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs and many other species disappeared. The biggest mass extinction, which happened 252 million years ago, is, I think at this point, clearly known to have been caused by massive volcanism. That is, volcanoes 1 million times larger than anything ever experienced by humans. And so yes, there's a variety of causes. Each of them carries a certain type of selectivity in that the end Cretaceous extinction was harder on some groups than the end Permian one, and vice versa.
That's one of the most important points that you make, is this evolutionary thing. So we tend to think of evolution as linear, and that if it's going to fade, it'll come back in the same way. But you have made the point that a particular extinction may impact evolution. It's not only just species, but evolution itself a little differently. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. You know, for 150 million years before the end Cretaceous impact, dinosaurs ruled terrestrial communities, and most mammals were little shrew-like things that, you know, lived in forests at night. Once all the dinosaurs disappeared, they didn't come back. They were extinct. But within about 10 million years, all of the orders of mammals that we see today had evolved. So in some ways, mass extinction is a refresher and it gives new opportunities. On the other hand, we should take no comfort from that because the time scale is millions of years.
Okay. And in each case, there was this an increase in diversity, it sounded like, or it seems like. Is that true from over time, that I guess after the Permian, then you have this mammals start to evolve more and so on?
Well, there's an overall increase in diversity. I always tell my students that at least at the beginning of the last century, there were probably more species on land and in the oceans than there had been at any other time in Earth history. But it isn't linear, and it isn't simply a response to extinction. One of the things that we found, and we just published a paper on this recently, is that we can quantify the ecological impact of these extinctions. And commonly what will happen is the fabric of ecology breaks down because so many species disappear. And then when it reassembles with different types of species, and they may or may not allow you to have more diversity than you did before.
Okay. What I was thinking was that it seemed to be a development for more sophisticated creatures. I don't know if that's a proper thing to say, you know, like us.
Well, I mean, jellyfish have done pretty well
I
too.
have to
So
be careful.
we don't necessarily want to make it about us. But there's no question that with the rise of mammals, of which our ancestors were part, that made the world a different place than it had been before.
Okay. Then in the present situation, in the past extinctions, these are all brought about by natural forces. And I wonder if we can say the same, that, you know, the prospects are the same for, say, evolution, rebounding, and having that resilience when this kind of an extinction in progress is brought about by man-made factors that have poisoned the environment and so on. They don't break down in the same way.
Yeah, there's two aspects to that. And you're absolutely right that in each of the geologically induced mass extinctions in the past, diversity did recover, but it recovered on a time scale of millions of years.
Yes.
So if you're concerned about your great-grandchildren,
forget
extinction
that one.
is forever. That's right. The other thing is that, you know, it was a terrible day when a meteorite hit the Earth 66 million years ago, but the next day the Earth began to heal. What we are doing now doesn't necessarily carry the promise of immediate healing, that unless we change our ways.
Yes, okay. So there's that factor. I'd like to come back to that one as well. In terms of evolution, of just as being a process that it has shown enormous resilience, at the rate of die-off right now, I'm thinking of the corals, I'm thinking in Australia, this massive die-off of animals and so on, of organisms, of the insect loss and so on. You have pointed out that I think that it depends on what gets hit, you know, perhaps at different times, how well nature can respond. What do you think about this present situation?
Well, it's interesting that what is happening in the 21st century has a distant mirror, and that is what happened 252 million years ago when massive volcanism spewed large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. At that point, there was global warming. The Earth got warmer. Because the Earth got warmer, the oceans are warmer, they can't carry as much oxygen, so oxygen was depleted in the oceans. And because so much of that CO2 got dissolved in seawater, pH went down, something we call ocean acidification. So if you read the newspaper, you'll find out that right now we have global warming, ocean acidification, and oxygen loss from subsurface water masses in the oceans. And one of the things that we did probably 20 years ago now, at a time when people had just started to identify geological correlates of extinction, very few people were trying to study the pattern of selectivity, what survived, what died. And so my friend Dick Bombach and I simply spent months in the library and looking at the physiological consequences of increased CO2. And we made sort of a checklist of what kind of organisms should be tolerant and what kinds should not be. And it turned out that was a very good description of what actually happened.
Predictive.
And now, in the 21st century, that pattern of extinction at the end of the Permian is proving to provide a pretty good roadmap for the vulnerabilities of populations, at least in the oceans today.
Okay, that's in the oceans.
Yes.
And in the Permian, we didn't have us and a lot of other things, right?
Well, we
didn't have 6 billion people on the earth.
It's not really comforting to
Right.
know that what we're doing today is matched only by volcanism a million times larger than anything we know. So.
Right. No, that was really very interesting, though, because you were able to predict what might survive in an ocean environment. I assume that you're taking this forward for like land as well.
Yes.
Let me add another thing there. Since we have a human factor now all over the planet, and one of the big problems is that with the rising sea level, places to live are disappearing while the population keeps increasing and so on. What is the effect of something like that? Can you squeeze that into that kind of model?
In a sense you can, in that we have a good, really quantitative idea of the relationship between habitable area and how many species there are. Now, it has to be said that the kind of sea level change we're talking about over the next century, the direct effects of that on biological diversity will be small. The effects on Miami, Bangkok, Venice, Bangladesh are going to be catastrophic.
Right.
But I think in terms of overall diversity, sea level change is not necessarily our biggest problem.
All right. Then let's take the life for that. Then if you lose the corals, that's so critical, and an ecological system just in general, I think, in the oceans, right? So many other creatures depend on that. If you lose that, is there a kind of, a spill effect from that? In other words, a whole bunch of other things go as a result of the loss of that, and did that come in your model as well?
Yeah, there's an ecologist at the Harvard Forest in central Massachusetts named Aaron Ellison. And Aaron has talked about what he calls foundation species, things that we usually don't worry about in terms of extinction because they're common. You know, the beech trees and oak trees in the forests in Massachusetts, or corals, but everything else in the ecosystem depends on the health of those species. So without question, since corals are vulnerable to a number of environmental changes.
And don't come back real fast, right?
Well, this is an interesting thing.
Oh, okay.
I think we are in some danger of having catastrophic loss of coral reefs, and as you pointed out, that will not only affect corals, but these are hotspots of biological diversity, and many of the things that simply depend on the corals for the physical structure of their environment will be in jeopardy.
Has this a continuing an impact so that you lose something basic? You pointed out that even the trees, particular trees, that the ecology depends on this. It's kind of a root force. The corals are the same in the sea. When you lose that, it has this other effect that you pointed out.
That's right.
Basic,
These species structure the environment, so it's not because they're eating something or depend on something else. The physical structure of the environment will change dramatically if those species are no longer around.
Okay. Is there a parallel back in these earlier times, extinctions that you came up with, like in the Permian?
Yes,
you see what I mean? So there was
it
this,
varies from one extinction to another. So at the end of the Permian period, all reefs disappeared. And there were essentially no animal-built reefs for several million years thereafter. On the other hand, in the Permian, most of the changes that I mentioned with ocean acidification, loss of oxygen, are things that are peculiar to the oceans. So the effects on life in the sea was devastating, perhaps not so devastating on land, whereas at the end of the Cretaceous period, a majority of coral species survived, and land, particularly land animals, were devastated.
Okay.
So it depends on the nature.
That was one of your big points, and glad to get that one straight. In terms of, right now we seem to have both in the oceans and on land. So I was curious about the loss of insects. We hear about the bees, the honeybees, for instance. Well, we depend on these things for pollinating, and a lot of other insects that are a base food for many other creatures. Is this similar to what has happened before, where we have both sea and land species threatened?
Yes, and it's distinct in the sense that, and this will not make you feel any better about it, that most of the changes in the biota on land and sea that we read about are not the direct result of global change, at least up to now. That is, there are very good censuses of vertebrate animals on land, and populations seem to have dropped by about 60% during my lifetime.
But not from climate change?
No, because of other things we do. We hunt things, we exploit them, we spoil habitats, things like that. Many insect populations seem to have plummeted. There have been a loss of, I forget the exact figures, but about 25% of the living corals on the Great Barrier Reef. All of that was due to human influences, but most of it was not a direct result of changing climate. Now, the bad news is that we're continuing to influence natural populations in all the ways that we have done before, but now superimposed on that, the environment is changing at a geologically high rate, and so it's a double whammy. And I think we have to be doubly concerned about what we need to do to vouchsafe our diversity for our grandchildren.
Right. Could you expand a little bit on that kind of accelerated climate change thing, because I think there's a great deal of confusion about that. People think, well, there are these little cycles and stuff, but geologists and biologists have pointed out, oh, this is a little faster than what is normal.
Yes. That's an important point. I can find many times in geologic history when there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we will contemplate in the 21st or 22nd century. I can find times when it was warmer than we contemplate in the 21st century. The difference is that organisms respond or don't respond mostly to the rate of change. And the rate of change in the environment, for example, the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment has increased by about 1/3 since I was born. And that is not something that is characteristic of business as usual in the geologic record. We know that that has happened at several distinct moments in the geologic past, and they are almost always associated with a loss of biologic diversity.
Okay, all right. Which is brings us to the next thing then. Does this suggest that evolution as a process cannot be quite resilient enough? That, what are the parameters there for it to respond adequately to something that is accelerated like this?
Well, I think that there will still be organisms a million years from now. I think we have to think about the resiliency of individual species or ecosystems. So yes, it is the case that what makes populations vulnerable to extinction is loss of population. And so from that perspective, we should be concerned for any number of plant and animal species. It's also the case that in some ways, the landscape of evolution changes in a human world. There's a lot of evolution happening now because of our use, perhaps even overuse of antibiotics. There are antibiotic-resistant strains of any number of bacterial and protozoan disease vectors. Cockroaches and rats are doing just fine.
So I've heard.
So some species benefit from large and negligent human populations, but many of those species that we wish to preserve, elephants, for example,
Yeah, right.
bald eagles, population sizes and geographic ranges have declined enough that I think many of these species need our help.
Okay, all right. Then it's not so much evolution itself. Evolution keeps responding.
Right.
It is selective in terms of what can proceed, what can survive. Is that the idea? So then what survives may be quite different in the end than we would expect right now. How about humans?
Well, I don't
Should I ask?
I don't think the human population is in any danger of going extinct. There are, again, when I was born, there were fewer than 3 billion humans on this planet. Now there's 7.5 billion.
Yeah, I
and the
know,
number is
growing
up
all the time.
So I think that humans will be abundant and an important planetary force 200 years from now. What will change, however, if we choose to allow it to change, is our environment. I mean, I find myself heartsick when I think that my grandchildren might never get to see a rhinoceros
I know,
or something like
right.
that. And part of that's aesthetic, and part of it goes back to the sense that, for better or for worse, we are the stewards of the planet. And what will be here 200 years from now is going to be based on decisions that we make. So I can imagine that there's plenty of humans all over the planet, but living in a world that is impoverished from the standpoint of the diversity of life, and that I think in many ways has aesthetic consequences, but also an environment that's made more vulnerable by having loss of the kind of diversity that makes ecosystems robust. So we put ourselves into an impoverished and therefore more vulnerable state of the Earth system if we choose to ignore what's happening now.
Okay, which is the next point. What do you think we should do in here? I bring this up because people feel like they would like to shut it all out. They are, it is very daunting, this bad news all the time, and people feel isolated and they don't know what to do. And what's your take on this?
Well, you can't shut it out.
Okay.
A lot of climate models predict stronger hurricanes, loss of rainfall in the Midwest, where a lot of our crops are grown. So, putting your head in the sand doesn't change anything at all. So I think there are a number of things that we can choose to do, and I hope we will choose to do. One is the root cause of climate change, which we know for a fact, I should say, is predominantly the burning of fossil fuels.
Yes.
And there are various ways that that's been established without any question. Now, the plain fact is that, I drive my car to the grocery store on Saturday. I fly in airplanes and that. And I think it's going to be difficult to simply stop doing those things. But we can do them with engineering that uses less, you generate less CO2 for the act. So different kinds of cars, electric cars, hybrids are good. And airplane engines have become far more efficient over the last 20 years. So I think we can get more bang for our buck in the fossil fuels we do burn. At the same time, I think overwhelmingly we will go toward renewable fuels. And in part, that's going to be forced on us. I mean, the most optimistic predictions for oil and gas suggest that, in the lifetime of your great-grandchildren, they better be using something else, because we're going to run out of those things and they'll become very much more expensive. There's plenty of coal, but you know, as of 2019, coal is actually more expensive than many renewable fuels.
Right.
So we have an opportunity to step by step change the way we do business, which is useful. We do not as yet have effective engineering solutions to global change, although I can imagine, I would almost predict, and I certainly hope, that within my children's lifetime, there will be reasonably inexpensive ways to actually scrub CO2 from air. There's a lot of research going on in that. We're not there yet, but one could hope. So all the things that change the environment, we can actually influence through the choices we make, both as individuals and as voters. And then at the same time, there are all these other things that we do. We exploit species.
Yes.
The reason that rhinoceroses are going extinct is not climate change, it's poaching.
Yes. Yeah,
and we can choose to block international trade in rhinoceros horn or elephant ivory, things like that. We can choose to guard against pollution. There are all sorts of choices that we can make, and I think have to be made for our own sake, you know, not only for the sake of rhinoceroses, but the sake of our own environment. And collectively, if we, you know, as individuals, as residents of Massachusetts, as Americans, and as global citizens, can get behind efforts to make the world a better place. I think we can, but it's high time we get going. There does come a point after which it will be very difficult to come back.
I think that is one of the big problems, is that you need governments to be doing this at the end of the day.
Right.
And there has been a reluctance to really do things, what has to be done. And there is still a lot of power from the oil industry and so on in terms of determining how long we can drag our feet. But if people can be motivated to get out there and demand change, then that might be a good thing. And in addition, all the renewable energy creates a whole lot of jobs and just a healthier environment and everything. In your view, if we can move, say now, next 20 years, then can we preserve life adequately if we sort of rethink the way we produce meat, the way we, the way we use our resources and so on?
I think we can preserve much of the diversity we have today. I think there are things that are consigned to extinction.
Yeah.
I'm happy to say. I did want to go back to the point about governments. It's easy to blame things on governments, but you know, in this country, the people who are in power in government are people we voted for.
Yeah.
So if you don't like it,
yeah,
it's time to get out and vote.
Yes, it's a very important thing, and to be an intelligent voter.
Yes.
Another thing that is happening is a lot of appointments are being made that are damaging the science agencies and so on, that we do not have control over, but that if people made enough noise, then that might change. But absolutely, it's true that voters need to grow up and do their proper thing. Dr. Knoll, I would like in the last few minutes to talk about your forthcoming book and also this fabulous award.
Okay.
Should be a Nova on that or something here. But we start with this book that is coming first, if we may. So once again, we have Life on a Young Planet, which is a wonderful book, but I understand you're undertaking something a little different in the new one, and we hope to have an event around that too. So,
yeah, I'm writing a book in part for the reasons that we just discussed. You know, every one of us is tethered to the earth by gravity. We're always in contact with the earth. We depend on the earth for almost every aspect of our livelihoods. And I think the average person in the street has very little understanding of the planet beneath our feet. And so the book that I'm writing is really an attempt to bring the story of the Earth, how it works, what its history is, to all people.
Yes.
Really.
Not just STEM programs.
No, that's right. This I hope it's something that an intelligent high school student could read with enjoyment and profit. Too. And at the end of the day, I think if the final chapter in this book will take us from the past into the future, and I think we can only hope that people will act responsibly as citizens if they understand the Earth and its vulnerabilities and its opportunities. And so that's really the aim, to just sort of give people a sense of this wonderful planet we live on, has a 4 billion year history. We are the product of that history, and we will determine the next chapters in that history.
Right, that's so great. And I hope it will bring about, as here in your work is very famous for the integration of the geological, the chemical, the biological, that these things are absolutely interdependent, and that I think we don't have a very good understanding of that in the public, that geology is over in that department and biology is over in this department, and
You're
so
right,
on.
it's the way we're taught.
Exactly.
It's
so we
the
don't
science
have
of the 19th
integrated.
century,
Yes.
and integration is the science of the 21st century.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you see people moving in that direction,
Absolutely,
evidently.
yeah.
Certainly you're one of the leaders of that, but I hope it will come out in this book a little bit too, to make people understand that this stuff all goes together and that we have to appreciate it really
that's the hope,
differently. Yes, so we'll look forward to that book
great.
and the movie that goes with it and so on and so on. I can't resist asking about this incredible award. Would you please tell us a little about that? So you've had loads of awards, but this must have been a wee bit different. What's the name of it and what happened?
Okay, the award is the International Prize for Biology. It's one of those things that I don't think you would ever think about. Sometimes nice things just fall out of the sky, and this is one of them.
It surprised you?
Yes, and it is something that I think I was the 34th laureate of this, and some of the people I admire most, like Wilson, were previous winners, and so it was just lovely, to receive this great hospitality from the Japanese people and this nice award, just saying that you did okay.
It's a little more than okay.
And the opportunity actually to meet and converse with the Emperor and Empress is not one that ever happened to this Pennsylvania Dutch boy before, and probably will not again. So yes, it's just something that happens once in your lifetime.
Oh, yes, but not to everybody. So, you know, and I'm not sure, I don't know how many Americans have received the award either, for that matter, but
it's about half, I think,
really?
of that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, American science is pretty rich.
Yes, yes, but I think it must have been pretty swell to be honored in this fashion. It's really a neat thing to be doing. And so we're coming to the end now. I just want to make sure that our viewers understand there's a forthcoming book. We'll keep you posted on this, and I talked to you that maybe we could have an event around this, a public lecture or something like that, to talk about that book when that one comes out. And you said that is to be published in the winter?
That's the hope. I'm about halfway through.
That's what all the authors
drafting
say.
It. I have my summer's work is cut out for me, but my expectation is that I will have finished, the text of the book by the end of the year, which I always tend to think is the beginning of the end, and publishers tell you is the end of the beginning. But I think in 2020, I'm pretty sure it'll be finished.
Okay, all right. So it is coming.
Yeah, it's
soon,
coming along.
Coming soon to a theater near you, and so on. We wish you the very best, and we appreciate the enormous amount of work that you have done, but not only professionally, but in trying to bring this to the public as well. Again, I recommend this book. This is a wonderful read, and I'm sure the next one will be also. But Dr. Knoll has done so much in terms of showing the importance between the type of the extinction and particular effects on life, selected, I should say, maybe selected effects, and how evolution works in that manner. Thank you ever so much for your enormous contributions.
My pleasure.